Ladies and gentlemen, if you're over 60, it's time to face a powerful truth, and you cannot treat your body and brain the same way you did when you were 20, especially when it comes to how you manage your sexual energy. What once felt like harmless release in your youth can now silently sabotage your focus, drive, and even your long-term vitality. Let's begin with your neurochemical timing. Every act of sexual stimulation triggers a cascade of brain chemicals, primarily dopamine, prolactin, and serotonin. When you're young, your brain rebounds quickly. But in your 60s, those spikes and crashes don't bounce back the same way. You're now working with a more fragile neurochemical architecture that governs not just your pleasure, but your motivation, memory, and hormonal equilibrium. The truth is, dopamine spikes without purpose erode your natural drive. When you masturbate in isolation, without intimacy, meaning, or conscious intention, it creates what scientists call a dopamine deluge without a reward mechanism. That means your brain receives pleasure, but without a goal attached to it. Over time, this rewires your motivational circuitry, leading to decreased ambition, emotional flatness, and even depressive symptoms. This is why you must stop masturbating the way you did at 20. Rushed, dewy, frequent, screen stimulated, and dopamine draining. That youthful pattern was reactive, not reflective. You've earned the right to graduate to something deeper. Instead, start learning the power of sexual energy cycling. Your libido is not a nuisance. It's a reservoir of creative and physical vitality. Practices like non-ejaculatory stimulation, breath work, focused arousal, and mindful touch allow you to circulate that energy rather than dump it. You transform tension into clarity. You evolve pleasure into presence. One of the biggest culprits of dysregulated arousal in older men is visual stimulation, especially from screens. Images bypass the imagination and hijack your brain's reward system. So it's not real connection. It's artificial inflation followed by emotional deflation. Your visual cortex becomes overstimulated while your emotional circuits grow numb. This leaves you chasing novelty, but never achieving true satisfaction. If you want to reclaim your power, return to internal arousal, imagination, sensation, connection with a partner, or even teething paired with touch. That kind of stimulation activates a different neural pathway, one that fosters bonding, oxytocin release, and long-term hormonal balance. Here's what most don't realize: your circadian rhythm governs your hormonal quality. Testosterone, cortisol, and dopamine are all deeply tied to your sleep-wake cycles. If you masturbate late at night under artificial light, especially after screen exposure, you're directly interfering with the rise and fall of these hormones. It's not just about the act. So it's about the timing. Finally, this stage of your life is an invitation to rewire desire toward purpose. Don't use arousal as a distraction. Use it as fuel. Channel it into physical training, creative work, mentoring, or spiritual development. When you reassign sexual energy into a mission, your brain adapts. Your vitality returns, your testosterone aligns with your intention, and most importantly, you don't feel like you're leaking life. You feel like you're storing it. So don't masturbate like you're 20. You're not escaping stress anymore. You're cultivating strength. You're not chasing pleasure. You're embodying purpose. Redirect, rewire, reclaim. Your biology is listening. Neurochemical timing dictates long-term motivation through the precise orchestration of dopamine release, receptor sensitivity, and baseline restoration, particularly in the context of repeated behavior like sexual stimulation. When a man over 60 engages in habitual, unstructured ejaculation, especially in isolation, the initial surge in dopamine may feel invigorating in the moment, but over time, it causes downstream disruptions in dopaminergic tone. Unlike in youth, where receptor systems rebound quickly and baseline levels are resilient, the aging brain becomes less plastic and more sensitive to overstimulation and depletion cycles. When dopamine is released too frequently or at irregular times, such as late and under artificial light or through passive digital arousal like pornography, it leads to a distorted signal-to-noise ratio in the brain's reward circuitry, weakening the motive salience of meaningful activities like physical training, deep relationships, or creative pursuits. This mismatch between dopamine peaks and the absence of goal-directed behavior leads to a decrease in the availability of D2 receptors, which are responsible for effort-based motivation and drive, thereby conditioning the brain to seek low-effort, high-reward stimuli and avoid tasks that require sustained attention or delayed gratification. In this rewired state, even formerly enjoyable or purpose-driven behaviors begin to feel effortful or dull as the brain's reward prediction errors skew toward immediate novelty rather than long-term fulfillment. For older men, this desynchronization of reward signaling not only diminishes mental clarity and physical ambition, but also blunts the ability to form and maintain deep emotional bonds. as the neurotransmitters responsible for intimacy like oxytocin and serotonin require a stable dopamine foundation into the neurochemical symphony of connection and commitment, and dopamine without purpose degrade, drive by hijacking the brain's motivational architecture through repetitive, high-intensity reward signals that are divorced from meaningful outcomes. In the male brain, especially post-60, this becomes a critical vulnerability. When sexual stimulation is pursued without a larger framework of connection creation or intention, the dopamine release it triggers begins to mimic the neurochemical pattern of addiction, intense followed by receptor desensitization and motivational depletion. These dopamine bursts, when not anchored to behavior that moves the individual toward goals, such as physical training, intellectual effort, or relational intimacy, are interpreted by the brain as hollow wins. How do we? Triggering a reward system recalibration that lowers baseline pleasure sensitivity. The midbrain's mesolimbic circuitry, particularly the ventral tegmental area and nucleus accumbens, become saturated with rapid feedback loops that over time promote apathy, indecision, and a preference for ease over challenge. This shift reduces the efficacy of dopamine in its core function, energizing forward movement, enhancing curiosity, and sustaining long-term effort. When ejaculation or arousal is pursued out of boredom, habit, or escapism, rather than as a reward for accomplishment or an act of bonding, it sends mixed signals to the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system, weakening the neurological link between effort and reward. As a result, behaviors that require sustained attention, delayed gratification, or resilience, such as rebuilding muscle, deepening relationships, or contributing to a purpose larger than the self, begin to feel burdensome, even repellent. The body may still carry the hormonal machinery of masculinity, but the brain's drive circuitry is subtly rewired to prioritize immediate gratification over meaningful progression. This is particularly dangerous with age, as neuroplasticity slows and behavioral ruts become harder to reverse, leading to a chronic state of understimulation paired with overexposure to artificial pleasure cues such as digital erotica, compulsive scrolling, or mental fantasy loops that further unmoor dopamine from its biologically intended function as a fuel source for forward momentum and personal evolution. Sexual energy must be cycled, not because its raw biological potency extends far beyond reproduction or pleasure. It is a central engine for cellular regeneration, mental clarity, hormonal balance, and directional motivation, especially in aging men whose endocrine systems have become more sensitive to depletion. When ejaculation becomes the endpoint of every arousal, the male body is forced into a neurochemical crash cycle marked by a spike of prolactin, a drop in dopamine, and a withdrawal from the sympathetic arousal state into parasympathetic exhaustion. Over time, this repeated draining of life force energy leads to what some neuroscientists refer to as post-reward collapse, where the body's ability to sustain elevated testosterone, mood-regulating endorphins, and neuroplastic growth factors is compromised. In contrast, when sexual energy is consciously circulated through practices like breathwork, non-ejaculatory arousal, pelvic floor engagement, and meditative redirection, the body enters a state of neuroendocrine feedback that actually enhances testosterone production, upregulates mitochondrial efficiency, and increases brain-derived neurotrophic factor BDNF, which plays a vital role in memory, cognition, and neural resilience, rather than a discharge of energy that leaves the body depleted and the mind unmotivated. Cycling sexual energy creates a feedback loop in which arousal acts as a fuel for transformation, enhancing mental sharpness, emotional regulation, and physical vitality. The autonomic nervous system's toward coherence, reducing stress markers like cortisol, and improving vagal tone, which governs heart rate variability and emotional adaptability. Additionally, from a neuroelectric standpoint, retained sexual energy appears to amplify coherence between brain hemispheres, enhancing pattern recognition, spatial awareness, and intuitive cognition, all of which tend to decline if left unstimulated. As men age, their system no longer compensates as easily for energetic waste. What was once a momentary lapse becomes a multi-day drain on energy, focus, and motivation. This makes the conscious conservation and redirection of not just an esoteric concept, but a neurobiological necessity for maintaining masculine drive, presence, and physiological robustness. In the later decades of life, a visual stimulation alters brain wiring by directly reshaping the neural pathways responsible for desire, attention, reward prediction, and behavioral reinforcement, particularly when the stimulation is artificial, repetitive, and hyper-novel in nature. The visual cortex is not a passive receiver of imagery. It actively interprets and categorizes stimuli in collaboration with the limbic system, meaning every exposure to sexual imagery triggers deep activation in areas like the amygdala, hippocampus, hypothalamus and nucleus accumbens. These areas encode not just the image itself, but the emotional charge, novelty response, and reward valuation associated with it. When a man repeatedly consumes digital sexual content, especially in the form of fast-switching, high-definition pornography, it trains the brain to seek novelty rather than connection, intensity rather than intimacy, and pixels over presence. The result is a rewiring of the dopaminergic system where the brain becomes conditioned to only respond to exaggerated stimuli, rendering real-life sexual experiences or emotionally connected intimacy less stimulating by comparison. This phenomenon, often referred to in neuroscience as reward system desensitization, leads to a progressive numbing of the response to natural cues and an overactivation of craving circuits in the prefrontal cortex and orbitofrontal regions. Over time, this distorted wiring diminishes the ability to form long-term bonds and reduces oxytocin receptor sensitivity, impairing trust, empathy, and the neurochemical signals that sustain relationship stability. Additionally, the act of pairing arousal with constant visual novelty causes the basal ganglia to reinforce compulsive behavior loops, making it harder for the individual to break free from the stimulus-response cycle. Neuroimaging studies show that chronic exposure to erotic imagery changes gray matter density in key motivation areas and reduces connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and deeper limbic structures, impairing judgment, impulse control, and emotional self-regulation. For men over 60 whose neuroplasticity is more limited and hormonal responsiveness less robust, this rewiring becomes especially problematic as it accelerates cognitive dulling, emotional flattening, and an erosion of authentic sexual polarity that thrives on real-world cues such as scent, voice, touch, and sustained eye contact. The overstimulation of the visual channel monopolizes the brain's reward anticipation system, pulling resources away from purpose-driven pursuits, meaningful relationships, and even spiritual clarity, leaving the individual more fragmented, less focused, and increasingly dependent on artificial inputs to feel a baseline sense of aliveness or pleasure. Circadian rhythms impact hormonal quality by regulating the precise timing, amplitude, and synchronicity of endocrine secretions that govern energy, libido, cognitive function, and emotional stability, especially in older men whose biological systems become increasingly reliant on temporal alignment for optimal function. At the core of this regulation lies the suprachiasmatic nucleus SCN in the hypothalamus, which acts as the body's master clock, synchronizing peripheral systems like the adrenal glands, tests, and pineal gland to the light-dark cycle through rhythmic gene expression. Testosterone, cortisol, growth hormone, and melatonin each follow distinct circadian patterns that, when disrupted by late-night stimulation, artificial light exposure, or erratic sleep patterns, lose their rhythmic integrity and begin to release in blunted, misaligned, or diminished pulses. For instance, testosterone production, which normally surges in the early morning hours in alignment with REM sleep, depends heavily on consolidated deep sleep, specifically stages 3 and 4 of non-REM, where the pituitary gland secretes luteinizing hormone to stimulate Leydig cells in the tests. When sleep is fragmented by late night screen use or overstimulation from pornography, this hormonal cascade is attenuated, leading to reduced testosterone output and impaired sexual function, motivation, and muscle maintenance. Likewise, cortisol, often misunderstood as purely a stress hormone, is essential for morning alertness and metabolic activation, but only if it peaks sharply at dawn and tapers by evening. Irregular ejaculation at night, especially when paired with blue light exposure and digital stimulation, interferes with the natural cortisol slope, dueling morning wakefulness and increasing nighttime restlessness. This hormonal desynchrony creates a feedback loop where fatigue during the day reduces the drive for physical activity, which in turn further lowers testosterone and dopamine, while poor sleep quality at night fails to replenish neurotransmitter stores and immune function. Melatonin, the hormone responsible for initiating sleep and regulating circadian rhythm, is profoundly suppressed by both screen light and sympathetic nervous system activation triggered by sexual stimulate at night, delaying the onset of sleep and diminishing its quality. Over time, these subtle shifts in hormonal timing accumulate into more visible signs of dysregulation: decreased libido, emotional instability, midsection fat gain, brain fog, and mood flattening. The body, particularly after 60, loses its adaptive edge when these circadian cues are ignored, resulting in endocrine noise rather than harmony, where hormone levels may appear normal in blood tests but are functionally chaotic due to poor timing, shallow amplitude, and lack of phase coherence with the body's internal clock, leaving the individual hormonally present but rhythmically misaligned and biologically underpowered for the demands of vitality, focus, and deep human connection. A rewire desire toward purpose-driven intimacy by shifting the neurological, emotional and behavioral pathways that govern arousal away from isolated, novelty-seeking behaviors and toward experiences that cultivate emotional resonance, shared vulnerability, and long-term connection. In the aging male brain, where dopaminergic tone begins to flatten and oxytocin pathways become more vital for sustaining engagement, unstructured or screen-based arousal no longer nourishes the nervous system, it fragments it. Purpose-driven intimacy, on the other hand, engages multiple neural networks simultaneously, the prefrontal cortex for meaning and anticipation, the limbic system for emotional bonding.